Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 136. And this episode, we're recording a little before Sonic Frontiers comes out, but we are taking this as an opportunity to take a look at the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, its highs, its lows, where everybody argues about what its highs and lows are, what it should be, what it shouldn't be, who should it have, and all these other wonderful things. It's just so ripe for conversation, so it's too much for just Matt and I. So we are joined by, from Player One Podcast, Greg Sewart, and YouTuber and streamer G. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
We're so excited to have you both on. I've been aware of your work for so long. And like when the incredible Scoop Jessica, who I'm going to shout out, recommended y'all, it just seemed like kismet. It was perfect. And so before we get into the broader conversation about Sonic, because there are a lot of goddamn games, before we get to that, I thought a good starting point is for each of us to talk about our first experience with Sonic. You know, this is like Mario, like Zelda, and a few other franchises, has been around since almost the beginning of gaming. Like Atari, with the exception, and like Pac-Man being the oldest. This is one of the oldest, especially of the mainline franchises that are still going to this day. How successfully is arguable. And so I guess I'll start, and then we'll go to Jeff, and then Greg, and then G. Talking about our first experience with Sonic. I mean, mine is pretty straightforward and simple. It is with Sonic the Hedgehog on the Genesis. It's funny because I was a Nintendo kid. Everyone who listens to the show knows I'm a Nintendo kid, big Nintendo nerd. And like I had a Nintendo before I had a Genesis, but I got the Genesis when the re-release Square Genesis came out. And it came with both Sonic 1 and Sonic 2, the bundle that my parents got me. Nice. And so I played them in order. Even as a kid, I had ADHD and I was anal retentive. And so I had to play in order. And so I started with the first Sonic game. And to this day, I have a soft spot for the first Sonic game, which is more of a platformer than a speed-based game. The second game is when that really happens. But like even playing that recently in the Origins collection, I genuinely like the first game. It is definitely less like the other 2D Sonic games that came after, but it is one of those that like the level design, the music is so iconic to me that I can't help but love it. And it's so interesting to go back to that game having access to the spin dash in the Origins collection, because the game is clearly not designed for you to have the spin dash. Like it makes some of the wall breaks and some of the secrets so much easier to get. It's hard for me to believe how far this franchise goes back. And I have such fond memories of that first Sonic experience. And some of my favorite Sonic experiences are born out of that. Jeff, I'm curious, what was your earliest Sonic experience?
I don't know which was the first Sonic game that I played, only because it was always at some friend's house or something like that. I didn't grow up with the Sega Genesis. When I look back, I think mostly of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 because of how impressive the special stage looked at the time and everything else. But my earliest playing Sonic, really getting into it, was having a Game Gear. And I don't know a time that didn't come with Sonic the Hedgehog 2. So that's exactly what came with mine. So I played the crap out of that. And it's a tricky one. It's a difficult one. I've still never gotten all the way to the end without stage select code, simply because you need all of the emeralds to get to the last zone. And anyone who's played it on the Game Gear, Sky High Zone, fuck that emerald.
Agreed.
But I got all of the other Sonic games that I could reasonably find on there. I've never played Sonic Drift or Tails Adventure, but I've played 1, 2, Chaos, Triple Trouble, Spinball, all of those. I played a lot of Sonic on the Game Gear. And so my experience with it as a series, and one that's more in my bones, is Sonic as a platformer, because you could only go so fast on the Game Gear before there was blurring, before there was problems. And so I do love going fast, and in playing Sonic nowadays, I understand it for what it is and enjoy when it can do that. But in my head, it is kind of like a stop and start, quick dash platformer. And so when even modern games go that way, that tends to be where I like it the most.
It's funny because we'll talk about more about the Game Gear in a minute, but like Sonic Triple Trouble was one of my favorite Game Gear games, and
it's great.
Like revisiting it as an adult, I didn't realize how bad the screen crunch was. Like it's a box, and Sonic takes up like almost a quarter of the screen. Like,
and that was the one that they designed exclusively for the Game Gear. All of the other ones were Master System ports.
It's such a shame that one never came to Master System.
Yeah. It's just wild.
America missed out.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
But Greg, what about you? What was your earliest Sonic experience?
Well, I was a lot like you, Matt, actually, because I was a Nintendo kid. And of course, just coming off the joy of Super Mario Brothers 3, which I also count as one of my favorite games ever in 1990, my first experience was with the first game, and it was in 1991. I don't know what the ages are in this crew, but I was the perfect age for what Sega was doing at that point. I was 14 years old at the time. Well, 15 when the game came out, but I was 14 years old when they started to actually, market this thing, and they were starting to market to teenage boys, the MTV generation, those of us who were Nintendo kids but were aging out of what Nintendo was doing while they were sort of sitting on their laurels and still churning out amazing products and amazing games. But Sonic definitely spoke to me. I don't think there's been a more brilliant marketing approach.
You were
in
right
video
for
games.
blast processing.
I really was. I mean, those advertisements spoke to me completely.
Hell yeah.
So I was holding out for a Super Nintendo, and it was the promise of the Sega CD coming down the road, having rented the Genesis a few times here and there.
Nice.
And seeing what Sonic was going to be through magazines mostly, that I finally said, nope, I'm going Genesis. And I bought my Genesis about a month before Sonic came out. So I was stupid enough to buy it before I got Sonic for free. But
you got Altered Beast.
But I did get Altered Beast, and that was a
thing.
Mostly, That was 20 minutes. So, but yeah, then Sonic came out the next month, and that was my first experience with it. And you're right, it is a little bit different, I think, than the other 2D iterations, in only that it so perfectly encapsulates the feeling of a company that was reaching way beyond what it had done before as a home video game developer. There's something especially about that first stage where Sega had never done anything like that before. They were just punching so high above their weight in that moment against what Nintendo had been doing for years and really perfected, that you feel it. Even today when you play it, I feel it. You can feel it, that there's just, everyone's really just pushing that extra 110, and it worked. It really worked, and it hooked me immediately.
Gee, what about you?
Well, similar to Greg, my first instance with it was along with my Genesis. Like, I remember just seeing all the advertisements and whatnot for Sonic, right? And just being immediately drawn to the character. And like Greg too, like Super Mario Brothers 3, like games like that were basically, they were kind of my bread and butter. But at the same time, like I also played arcade games with my dad. So, little short story, they used to be part of a bowling league when I was growing up. And so every Wednesday and sometimes on Sundays, they would go bowling, and my dad would give me some money to go to the arcade. And then he would come play with me in the arcade afterwards. And this arcade had all the Sega games. Like they had Space Harrier, they had Afterburner, they had Outrun, they even had Alien Storm, which I know is one that a lot of people haven't played. So he got exposed to Sega that way. And then Sonic came around like in 91, and I got so drawn to the character and I wanted the game so badly that it's like, I want a Genesis. Like, well, we already have a Nintendo. But the thing was that it's like, well, but here's the thing, Dad, check it out. All these games we played together. It's like, oh, I don't know. And then, but it's got Arnold Palmer's Tournament Golf because he's a golfer. So he's like, well, then.
Whatever it takes.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever it takes. Grease the wheels a little bit. And sure enough, the blue little guy caught my heart immediately. And yeah, so Sonic on the Genesis was the first one that I really played. And I'm kind of with you guys that it really is a great game. But like going and you play the modern games now, it makes you realize just how different the original Sonic was. So even though I loved it back in the day, it might not capture my heart nearly as much as the sequels or some of the later ones do. And kind of a fun thing about me, because we were talking about like Master System and Game Gear and whatnot, because I had a Game Gear too.
Oh, yeah.
Sonic 1 on the Game Gear and the Master System is one of my absolute favorites.
It's
in the entire
a real
franchise.
good game.
I love it. I love Sonic 1 on the Master System. It's awesome.
An auto-scroller in a Sonic game is insane, but the game's fun.
Right.
The platforming is there. It's a damned good game.
It just works so well.
Yeah.
It works so well. And then like the pacing and whatnot is just so good. Again, not to discount the original, but that's where I got started. But of course, everything really started moving to quote unquote the next level for me is Sonic 2. That's really where it all. That's where it all went down.
I mean, I think like it's funny going back to Sonic 2 very recently. Again, I played the Origins collection. I was provided a review code for it, which was awesome. And we're going to get into my issues with that collection in a minute because I'm a big music nerd as well. But Sonic 2 on the Origins collection is one of the tightest ways to play that game. It runs well. It looks good. after they patched the stuttering out and all of that. But like Sonic 2 is one of those games that I can always go back to. I can always beat now as an adult. But like I remember as a kid just struggling with the not Metal Sonic, Robot Sonic and the Death Egg. Like it's just no rings. I've had rings this whole game. What are you talking about? You know? And like, of course, the debug mode built into the game, which is essentially an accessibility option, which I love. Like you can make it so you can kick both their asses. But like, what's interesting about this franchise is like it started as a 2D platformer because that's what people made, right?
Yeah.
3D was not a thing, though arguably Sonic did dive into 3D with 3D Blast before Mario.
Space Harrier was, but
yeah,
but like Sega was 3D before anybody, basically.
Right. Yep. But like the fact that now we have 2D, 3D, puzzle games, party games, like they're just over the years, like Mario, there's so many games that we have to like categorize them to separate them out just so we can track them. And I don't know, in the same way, I would say specifically with Zelda for me, because with Mario, I don't think I prefer 2D over 3D. I think I like the games as they are as I play them. But with Zelda, I prefer a lot of the top-down 2D games more than the 3D games. Not that there's anything wrong with them, and there are plenty of 3D games I enjoy. I just happen to enjoy that aesthetic more. I think with Sonic, it's closer to Mario where it depends on how good the game is. It's not so much 2D is better than 3D. Yeah. I'm curious for any of you guys if you feel that way also. I feel like Sonic, like Mario, is kind of just like, if this game is good, I will enjoy playing it. It's not like, oh, this is a 3D game. I don't know if I'll like it.
Before we go too far into this question, I do want to point out Sonic 2 on Genesis. Oh, it had a boss that didn't give you rings. Sonic 2 on the Game Gear Master System did that for every Act 3.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you want to complain about not having rings at the boss. Take down that ant lion on a Game Gear resolution, then come get me my Metamucil or something, because I'm going to be sitting on the Adirondack chair and complaining at the neighbor kids.
I love that we're like a few minutes into this and we're already talking about antlions. That's like a general Japanese game design thing that my Twitch stream always laughs about every time.
Antlions, always.
Yeah. I mean, I was playing Disney games yesterday for Extra Life and I was playing Quackshot. I think it was Quackshot. I don't know what it was. Anyway,
so good.
It was Quackshot. And in Mexico, I think the Mexico stage, there are these creatures that pop up out of the quicksand and fire these platforms up, and they're antlions. They're like Disneyfied antlions. And my whole chat was going crazy because it's like you play, especially in 80s or 90s,
antlions and eggplants. I don't get it.
I don't. I've even gone into the point. I've gone to the point. I know I'm getting off track. I'm sorry, but I've gone to the point where like I'll go on like Wikipedia. It's like, what is it about antlions in Japan? Like, is that a thing? Is there I don't know, is it the pincers? I have no idea what's going on. Like, are they regional? I don't know. Anyway, they're everywhere in video games. They are.
But yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I genuinely I like more Sonic games than I dislike, right? And even the Sonic games that I've disliked, like your Unleashed and your Forces, those games are not great, but they're fine. They're not bad games. You know, there are a few unabashedly bad games in the Sonic franchise, but even those, like I replayed Sonic and the Secret Rings not that long ago before I gave up my Wii, and like it's not a great game, but for what they made on the Wii with the Wii's technology, it wasn't awful. It was interesting. It was different. Like it was inconsistent, and like the still images versus the movement cutscenes and all of that. Like I think Sonic's biggest problem is inconsistency over anything else. Like
Absolutely.
Even Shadow the Hedgehog, again, a game that's trying to be different, not necessarily a bad game, had interesting pathing, like Star Fox, where like your decisions matter long before Mass Effect ever did that. Like I don't think those games are inherently bad. Even Sonic 06, the game that people like to hate on, I've played not that long ago on emulation. It's broken for sure, but like but for some of the stages are still genuinely enjoyable and fun to play. And so I think that's where Sonic really suffers. I think Sonic really suffers. Mario has always had this consistency of quality, even the quote unquote bad Mario games like Mario Sunshine. Like I played Mario Sunshine recently. It's a good game. It's not a bad game. It's just people don't jive with the controls or the style or the anything. But Sonic, genuinely from game to game, it's like, how is this the same team making these games? Like it's just they vary so much. I think that's where it hits the most roadblocks.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it too. But I also think that it really speaks to the resiliency of Sonic as a character because of exactly what you just said. I mean, like when you get with like Mario or Zelda or something like that, there are games that you end up not liking, but for the most part, it's a mechanic thing. It's a design thing. It's like, they took a shot and I either like or I don't like what they did.
Right.
But with Sonic, every time there's a new Sonic release, there's always this trepidation of like, is it going to be good? Is it going to be bad? But the fact that Sonic, I think, still maintains this level of popularity 30 years, is it 30 years? Yeah, 30 years
30 years.
later. Good God. 30 years later.
Oh, yeah.
In spite of the fact that the games have been so inconsistent, I think speaks a lot to actually the likability of the character himself, in that he can go through having these legitimately bad games, but still people are excited about a new release. Like there's something about that character that works.
I think it's really what it comes down to, like what I was talking about earlier. It's like there's just a natural draw to Sonic as a character. And the interesting thing is that how he still has that continue to draw even after having so many missteps. That the fans are so like he's got so many great fans that are willing to stick out through both the good and the bad. But at the same token, though, it's like you gotta have more good than bad, right? Eventually, it's gonna bottom out. So they have to come up with something really, really good. But yeah, we stick about it through the thicks and the thins, as they say.
Yeah, it's true. And I think we were talking about this a little before we started recording, but there's also that notion that because of the fervent fan base that Sonic has, and everyone has favorites and hates and everything else, that it feels as though, whether there is or isn't, it feels as though there is this onus on every new release to quote unquote save the franchise somehow, get it on track, get it one way or another. And I think something interesting is, and all y'all talking about this has sort of crystallized this for me, something interesting about a lot of long-running video game franchises is a notion of what is the through line, what is the consistency. Mario as a series has had so many different releases, gone in so many different directions, and the main crux, 2D, 3D, anything else with Mario is a sense of it being an athletic game. As it is, whether it's a platform or anything else, there's a certain amount of that to it. Even the RPGs have timing, I think, because of that. The Zelda games are about exploration and application of finds, for good or for ill. Sonic's greatest consistency is the design, because, it works as a slower platformer. It works as a speed game. But again, I admit I'm probably the greatest layman of Sonic amongst the four of us. But I don't know, what is that, like that thread, that piece that needs to be part of the gameplay? And it doesn't need to be whether it's a platform or a puzzle or a racing game or anything else. Is it the speed? Is it control? Is it momentum? It's probably about the momentum would be my best guess, but how is that applied throughout the franchise, regardless of genre? Because it can be.
Yeah, I'd have to say momentum. I'm right with you on that. We talked about this earlier about Sonic CD, about how, like, I think one of my biggest problems playing it when I was younger, because I didn't have a Sega CD when I was younger. So my exposure to it was very minimal until it wound up showing up on like later platforms later. And I thought it was great. And I know people say, oh, it's one of the greatest games of the whole franchise. And I played it recently as part of Sonic Origins. And then I realized my biggest issue I have with it is the flow. And if you think about it, like with so many different Sonic games that I kind of have issues with, there's almost one unified issue between all of them, and it's the flow of the gameplay. Now I understand, like, there's a whole, I like to call like the original Sonic like the gotta go fast generation of Sonic. The ones that like, oh, like you gotta go fast. Like it's like Sonic has never always been about going fast the entire time, ever since the very beginning. You try to go fast all the time, Sonic 1, you're gonna wind up dead. That's really how it is.
Yeah.
But with every game that's worked so well in Sonic, they all have one thing in common, and that's a consistent momentum. So when you break that momentum, that's when it starts to falter a bit. So I'd have to agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense. I think, like, one of the reasons that I think Sonic 3 and Knuckles is my favorite game in the franchise, and I will always consider that one game. I know they're technically two separate games, but they're
it's one game. It was meant to be one game. They broke it up because of McDonald's.
I would say based on Origins, Sega now considers it one game as well.
Yeah, and like
absolutely.
And that's like, it's my favorite game because the momentum is at its peak in those early years, right? Like, not only is the faster parts trying to outrun the screen scroll so vibrant in those moments, but also the storytelling, like, it's a one shot essentially, right? Like, we think about movies, like there are transition screens where you fight a boss and then something happens with Knuckles or whatever. But it rarely, I think, if ever, goes to black and then loads in another place. You literally transition from stage to stage. You find out why you're going to those places. And like Sonic 2...
I have no idea why I ended up in Chemical Plant Zone. I loved it. The music's incredible. But I know how I ended up in Hydro City Zone. We can argue about that pronunciation forever. But you know how you got there.
Yeah. And like, I think that speaks to this love of momentum and this lean into momentum, right? It's why Sonic 2 works and why Sonic 3 and Knuckles works really well. It's why even I think the Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2 games work really well, or even the Game Boy games like Sonic Advance and Sonic Rush. Like they all lean into that sense of momentum and flow. Like they add tricks to the Sonic Rush games and Rush Adventure. Like all of those feel natural. Even the 3D games later have tricks. Like all of these things that capitalize on momentum. The reason that Sonic Unleashed is not fun to play is not because of the werehog stages. I think it's cheesy, but it's actually a kind of clever idea. Like it's a werewolf story, and I like werewolf stories. Sure, why not? But like,
I unashamedly love Sonic the Werehog.
right. The problem with that game is that the momentum comes to a screeching halt in the God of War style stages where you're doing the melee combat. And if they had found a way to work in speed and momentum to those stages or the transition to those stages, I think it would have been a pretty good game. They also like just the combat is so slow. It takes forever to kill things. Again, no momentum, you know, that's why I'm eager. And we're going to talk about this more later to play Sonic Frontiers, because it does seem like they understand melee combat this time around. Like there seems to be a momentum to how you control Sonic in those open world areas and fight baddies and do air combat and do the special like trail that explodes or whatever. Like I think all of that seems to lean into what we're talking about, whereas the 3D games of the more recent years didn't do that. Like Sonic Forces at its best is doing that momentum stuff. Some of the created stages where you're grappling and some of the Sonic stages where you're running from area to area. It's when you then switch to the created character and like you're in the middle of something, or like you're suddenly doing a boss battle, or like the boss battle is an auto runner. Like a lot of that stuff hits or misses. I think that Geoff hit the nail on the head. And I think it's why people love some of the games that others don't, because they find the momentum in those games, even if the broader public is like, I don't like this.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think that you're right. Like when the transition was made to 3D, because I think Sonic is, you know, some of the 3D games are good or bad, depending on sort of what you're looking for. But I think Sonic's transition to 3D, I think we can all agree, has been really rough. And it's weird that I'm talking about that.
He said the thing.
It's a
Sonic made a rough transition to 3D.
Yeah. It's weird talking about that because it's been 20 years since that transition started. But and you look at the original Sonic Adventure, it's the same idea, is that like even combat, the best moments of combat in that game, the smartest thing they did was doing the homing attack.
Right? Absolutely.
Because there's a rhythm to it, right? And yeah, you can make the argument that it's an auto play. I don't really agree with that, but people do make that argument. But I mean, you know, there's a rhythm to that completely is translated from the 2D games earlier.
Yeah.
Where there's just, you know, yes, in the 2D games, I agree with you, G, completely. Mark McDonald and I used to have this conversation all the time on EGM because he was very much one of those push right to win Sonic people, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, right. Whatever, right? But I always argued like, no, you're missing what the game is. Yes, you can do that to a point, but the game is so much richer if you actually don't run through the stage as fast as possible and discover what's above and below and around the sort of critical path through the stage. And they with Sonic Adventure 1, I think they made that transition beautifully in that it's very similar. And you have that flow, you have that rhythm that I feel like some of the later Sonic games, Werehog being a perfect example, they completely botched. And it's
I have to agree on that. There's one 3D, we'll get to it a little bit later, the questions I think you're going to ask, but it's one 3D Sonic game I think accentuates that perfectly, Greg, but I'll hold off and talk about that for now.
That's fair. I honestly think that Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 are very, very good games trapped in the design and issues of the time, because Sonic wasn't the only one having a rough transition into 3D. And Sonic Adventure, look, we all remember seeing the whale. It still takes my breath away. Like, God damn it.
That's an iconic scene.
It's an iconic scene.
Just like City Escape in the second game.
City Escape.
Same thing.
Listen, I will roll around at the speed of sound all day long. But the thing is, when those games came out again on the GameCube, they did not do as well. They didn't sell as well. They didn't score as well because the cracks were already showing in the casing there. The ideas were good and there was some great ideas, absolutely. And I think that contrast of speed, momentum, twitch gameplay, and a little bit of slow and explore and find was there. There were some awkward points of working it together, the different storylines, figuring that out. But I think a lot of different members of the team got the wrong lessons from the underperformance of Sonic Adventure in future releases.
Yeah, I mean, and like they try to capture it in even the later games. Like Sonic Heroes, I will argue, is actually a great game stuck with a gimmick that doesn't always work. But like,
I agree.
It's the Donkey Kong 64 problem. Why do I need to stop and
Yes.
switch?
Yes.
but like, I genuinely like the teams. I think it's a good idea. The teams were some of the best parts, like Team Dark and stuff. Like,
Cool idea.
were some of the best parts
Conceptually.
of, yeah, and so like. It really is a case by case basis. And I think the reason that Sonic Mania, the return, as it were, to 2D in a successful way works as well as it does is not because it's somehow better than everything else. I think it's because it understood the assignment, right? Like Christian Whitehead and that whole crew understood the assignment and really leaned into what people wanted from that kind of game. Not that that kind of game is superior, but that they understood what people wanted. And like, for 3D Sonic Generations, again, like it's so strange that they, like with Sonic Forces, Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric and Sonic Lost World after it, just diverged so much again because Sonic Generations seemed to understand not every Sonic stage needs to be gotta go fast, but people want at least one or two stages where you're holding the boost button and you're just going because it looks awesome. And I think moments in stages and or full stages where it's not the only thing you're doing, I think is a smart way to do it. And like they're teasing that in the footage that we've seen of Sonic Frontier so far, you like go into some kind of simulation of older stages and you have moments like that where you get to relive that. And I think there's some intelligence to that because again, it's leaning into the momentum, and Sonic is about variety, really. Like, I think Sonic is one of the most diverse franchises as far as types of games that you had between the spin-offs that were like pinball, puzzle, party, whatever else, racing games. But even like Sonic had several RPGs, so did Mario, but like people forget that like BioWare made a Sonic game. They made a Sonic RPG. Like, was not good, but they made one.
Damn it, it exists.
It's all right. It's all right.
But like, I think that there is like stuff to love in the bad games in a way that like Mario doesn't really have many bad games, excluding the terrible Mario Party games, of which there are several. Like the mainline Mario games, you could argue are repetitive or monotonous, but even New Super Mario Brothers 2 and New Super Mario Brothers U, which isn't so new at that point, like are all solid 2D Mario games.
Sure.
In a way that like there are more missteps for Sonic, and I think makes it a more interesting franchise to look at. Whereas with Mario, it's like, yeah, a new game will probably be great. It's Mario. You know, Zelda has been, we're getting to a point where Zelda has been inconsistent enough that now we're not sure, right? The 3D Zelda games, like Sonic, some people either love or hate. Like Majora's Mask is the most divisive game in the Zelda franchise, but people either love it or hate it. There is rarely a middle ground. And I think Sonic just has that more frequently. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has more bad games. It definitely has more average games, but I think it's because it also has more games. There have just been more Sonic games, period. And so you're going to strike out more when you just make more of something.
That's very true.
I think we keep going back to Mario, and obviously that makes sense because, as you know, Sonic was designed to compete with Mario and with what Nintendo had there. But I think it's interesting too that, and I don't know if this is the reason why, but the quality issues really seem to start bubbling to the top as Sega started falling apart as a console manufacturer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't have that. The team at that point didn't have the advantage of being the flagship game on a single console. You know, like when you look at the Mario games, and I think it's less so now. Well, actually, I'm not even going to say that. But when you look at the Mario games, they've always been built around hardware, right? Especially when it comes to a controller. They've always been built around like, and whether you could make the argument that the hardware was built around the vision for the next Mario, or
they grew around
Mario
each other as
right, exactly. They're sort of symbiotic.
Yeah, there we go.
As we got to the end of the Dreamcast's short life, and that's when Sonic Adventure 2 was coming out, you can even see it in Adventure 2 where the polish is disappearing. You can tell it's been a quick turnaround, and it's sort of a company that's a little bit desperate, and things are not looking good internally. And then, you know, then you start shifting to development on multiple consoles. It's like, okay, so now we're not a first party anymore. The consoles are wildly different. We're dealing again with like PS3, Xbox, and Wii. When I worked in game development, that was the era I worked in, and it sucked because there were three wildly different sets of hardware you had to deal with.
Yeah, the architecture is not the same.
Right, exactly. So you're spreading yourself even thinner. You don't have the support that you used to have. You don't have the captive audience you used to have. And I feel like there was no guiding star there.
Yeah.
Probably starting around the year 2001. Well, starting around Sonic Adventure 2. And they've really sort of flailed around trying to find, where you look at like a Mario or a Zelda, like Matt, you mentioned with Majora's Mask, right? A perfect example. Yes, it's a very divisive game, but it's divisive because of the design decision that was made for the premise. It's not divisive because some people say it's a terrible game or it's a good game. The game itself is quite solid. I mean, it's just Ocarina of Time again, which is generally considered a great game.
Yeah.
They have that guiding star, and you get the feeling like we know we're trying something different, and we know that it's going to be probably controversial. But with Sonic, so many of the games that have been low quality, they have that sort of feeling of, we're not really sure what we should be doing with this character right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it also goes to the character himself, because Sonic in 91 and through the mid 90s, one of his biggest appeals was that he was edgy, right? I know me as a teenage boy, he's cooler than Mario. Mario's just like fat plumber who's like so watered down, and he's the Mickey Mouse of video games.
Right.
Whereas, Sonic's cool, and he's like, he gets angry when I'm not doing something in the game. He's tapping his foot, and like he's awesome. Although when you really look at the games themselves, they're very sweet. The whole story, it really reminds me of like The Simpsons. Like the whole story in the game is all about like environmentalism and saving small forest creatures from industrialization. Like it's a very sweet message.
Oh, yeah.
It's like Poochie started fighting the man, the video game.
Right?
Exactly.
Greg, per your point, like I heard somebody tell me once that they've felt that Sonic has gotten soft, quote unquote. Like Sonic's gone soft. I'm like, no, he's just evolved and he's grown his character.
And you've moved beyond skateboarding at mall
that.
security, okay? Look.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to evolve. It's like evolve, adapt, or perish. And I think he's done a really good job.
And I think it makes sense when you consider that his rise was also along the same time as the rise of like extreme sports, like, the Tony Hawk games and the BMX games and all that, like the grinding and the constant motion. Like Sonic fits that bill so perfectly. But I think even as a character, they've struggled to sort of keep him relevant in a way, because extreme has become such a different thing than it was in the early 90s. Even if you look at something like the WWE, right?
Yeah.
Where you get into the Attitude Era. Suddenly, extreme wasn't that one guy's a bad guy. Extreme was like, we're flipping the bird at everybody. And it's like, you've got your main characters coming out and shotgunning beer and stuff like that. Like, how does a character like Sonic remain extreme in sort of that environment? So I think they've had to struggle at least through like the early 2000s to sort of find his place again, because he wasn't the cool character anymore. What was cool with Sonic was so not cool anymore in the early 2000s.
Doesn't age well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. They use the word cringe. Is that where that falls into?
Yeah. Exactly.
It is the cringe. Yes, I believe it is.
We're all so old. It's fine.
Yeah.
But like, and I think also what keeps me coming back to the characters, the consistency and the growth of the personalities, right? Like Mario has sort of had a consistent narrative, right? Like the characters have grown, I think, more in the RPGs than in the platformers. But like even in the more recent platformers, we've seen character development for all the characters. Even Luigi in the Luigi's Mansion games has shown growth beyond being a coward, which is fun.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think it does it in a more isolated way so you can enjoy it. In the same way that like the Kirby games, I love that franchise. It's really about an elder god deciding not to consume all of an existence. But like they isolate those stories in a way that you could just play a game and enjoy it. And it's fun and it's fluffy. And like Sonic tried to do that, but then somewhere around like Generations, they wanted to link the stories, right? Like, time travel nonsense and other things that then plays into Sonic Forces and Sonic Mania, which are two sides of the same coin, supposedly, with the strange emeralds that are warping time. And I think that's also where it falters. Like, I think the reason that Sonic Colors has so much success, either the original or the re-release, whichever one you played, is because goes back to the kind of Mario and Kirby formula. It is an isolated story.
Yes.
You know the characters. It's Sonic and Tails being Sonic and Tails. Eggman has new robots that are his sidekicks that are kind of goofy and ridiculous. Like, it's more lighthearted. I think that's why it succeeds. In the similar way that while Lost World got panned a lot for its controls and other things, also is doing the same thing. It's where they did kind of learn their lesson from Colors, and they made it kind of an isolated story that exists in its own area. even the spin-offs like Rise of Lyric. Like I've heard the Sonic Boom cartoon is really cute, and I've watched some of it and I think it's all right.
Oh, the Boom cartoon's wonderful.
I've watched a lot of like clip collections and it's incredible.
But like the games, they falter, I think, also because they were so focused on mechanics and didn't let them be these isolated stories that the cartoon was telling. And I think that Sonic's biggest problem and why I'm excited for Frontiers again is because it does seem like Frontiers, while it's going to respect the history and it's going to have cameos from other characters, it's going to be its own story. Sonic's in a separate place. It's a different story. You're island hopping in isolated open worlds in a similar way to like Mario Odyssey, unsurprisingly. And like, I think that's where the strength is going to come from, because Sonic Forces, I think its biggest problem is not its controls, although they are inconsistent at best. I think it's its story, right? Like all of the other characters are glorified cameos. You only can play as Sonic and Shadow in the special Shadow episodes that are terrible. Like, but it's trying to continue the story from Forces and Generations, and it feels like a mess from that perspective that I think makes it hardest. The reason I think Sonic Mania is more successful is because while it is connected to that other stuff and it hints at it, it mostly exists in its own bubble. And I think that's where Sonic's strength is narratively, is when it just tries to kind of do a fun thing. You can hint at previous adventures and comment on the ongoing struggle of a white man getting knocked down by a blue hedgehog. But like at the end of the day, I think the strength is in isolating the story and letting every Sonic game be someone's first Sonic game, I think is a strength that a lot of these other ongoing franchises has. Like Zelda has made a career out of that,
Absolutely.
right? Like they are technically one giant confusing timeline, but because each Zelda game is a new hero, with the exceptions of a few direct sequels like Majora's Mask, like A Link Between Worlds.
And those are usually on the same console as well. It's not as if they're going back 30 years and this is the same Link from Link, except for Link Between Worlds. So I've just contradicted myself. Anyway.
But like Breath of the Wild 2,
most part,
which has a separate name that I've forgotten, like it's going to probably do something quite different, but it is a sequel story or a prequel story. It's unclear, but in the same world. And it happens so rarely. Mario also very rarely does direct sequels. You could argue that all of the Alpha Dream Mario RPG games are in the same world and in the same story, because they do feel like they're all connected. But like beyond that, it's like every Mario game is practically a new adventure. And I think that's where Sonic is at its strongest, but it doesn't know if it even wants to do that.
That's a great point. And you bring up Mario all the time. And I think one of the most brilliant things that Nintendo has ever done with the Mario stuff is that it seems very clear now that we consider that these Mario characters are players.
Yes. I was going to bring that up. Thank you. Please keep going.
They're like a theater troupe, right? I mean, that's really how they've been presented at this point. And that means that it's easy to start from zero in any game. Or if you want to call back to something that happened before, great. But you don't have to worry about what's canon. You don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And you're right. Sonic has not had that. And they also haven't been able to decide if that's what they want to do.
Right.
And further to, what I mentioned before, trying to be a little bit more extreme and cutting edge, I think is what's turned it into the situation where they keep trying to bring Sonic into the real world, into our world. And it's so hard to do that right. And they've not really succeeded at it. It's funny because with the movie, I feel like they did succeed at it finally.
Yeah. I would agree.
But they've tried for so long to do it and haven't really gotten it right. And it's like, I don't know if this is supposed to be light and fun or if it's supposed to be serious and dark. Like, what's going on here? I just want my blue hedgehog to run fast and break robots, right?
Yeah. It's like sometimes the direction is kind of all over the place when it comes to Sonic. And there are some times where it feels like they throw everything at the wall and sees what sticks, and what sticks is not a whole lot, but what does stick is like gold.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I'm all about like whenever the Sonic franchise tries something new. Like I love seeing whenever they want to try something new that's against go fast from point A to point B.
Right.
Like I always want to embrace something like that. That's why I'm looking forward to Sonic Frontiers. But at the same token, like I kind of roll my eyes a little bit whenever I see something come around and somebody says, oh, well, it's not as good as Sonic Adventure 2 or Sonic Mania or something like that. I'm just like, well, did you give it a chance?
Yeah.
Right.
And I understand if you give it a chance, you don't like it. Hey, that's one thing. But many times I feel like, a lot of the Sonic fans, they act like they want to embrace new things, but they don't really want to embrace the new things as they are. They want to say, hey, I want a new Sonic game that plays like the old Sonic game that I love, not a new Sonic game that's trying something new and unique.
Yeah. And Sonic's not unique in that, but it is especially egregious in Sonic. And I think at this point, it's good to point out that, yeah, like we mentioned Christian Whitehead, we've mentioned Sonic Mania, and a lot of this also in terms of like Greg was saying before about like understanding the assignment. There is the retro engine that has been around for a very long time. I don't have the dates in front of me, but that is a platform, an engine, a community of people making fan games within the built engine of 2D Sonic, of Sonic 3 and Knuckles and things like that. And so you have a dedicated fan base of people sort of chipping away at that. I mean, I know people have made ROM hacks and remakes that are fixes this issue, does that, puts the spin dash into Sonic 1, but also makes it less broken, anything like that. And having that level of dedication, and even for Sonic Mania, bringing in Christian Whitehead, who I think also, I do know that he spearheaded the Apple ports.
Yeah, the mobile ports.
The mobile ports, and was able to, put Hidden Palace into Sonic 2 finally and everything else. But a lot of that he sort of did as a proposal. It wasn't like he was hired to do it. It was just, hey, I love this shit. Mm-hmm. Here, can I please have some legitimacy for this? Yeah. And whereas, yeah, we were talking about before how a lot of issues with the Sonic franchise came about when Sega was fracturing. I mean, Sonic CD exists because two different teams on two different continents were making Sonic 2.
Yep.
And to have smaller visions come up and bring those things forward, they may not be perfect, they may not be for everybody, but you feel that understanding of the assignment. Because you know what, to kind of be silly about this, you should know your direction if you got to go fast.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And
I'm much, glad, yes.
And I'm glad Greg brought up the movies, because I have been a very vocal proponent of loving these movies. And like, not everyone likes the real world stuff, and I can see why, but they got very charming actors and actresses to play those characters. And I think that's what really, I mean, I love James Marsden. I love him in everything. You can put him in anything. Like, he's great. And so like, to have this very charming human protagonist play opposite Sonic, and the smart decision to make Sonic an inexperienced child,
yes,
I think really sells the franchise. And like, I'm not going to spoil the ending of the sequel, but like the sequel, like in the last half hour, does genuine lore drops to Sonic Adventure and some major franchises within the history that like, it just was like, I didn't even think we were ever going to go there. And now we're gearing up for a third game that could be exactly like the 3D Sonic games. And that's really fascinating to me. But even in the second game, like we saw in the trailers, like they have the Death Egg robot. Like they collect the Chaos Emeralds. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not a spoiler to say Sonic becomes Supersonic. Like, it was headed in that direction. And like, I think all of that stuff, like the first movie dabbled in the Sonic lore and fun stuff from the games. The second game is a homage. Like, there's even a coffee shop called The Mean Bean. Like, it literally leaned full force into what
it leaned into the Mean Bean machine.
The movie absolutely was made for the fans,
right?
And that's why it was made by fans for fans.
Yeah, the first one got us all in the door
so well.
Yeah. Yep. Like the first one got them the big money, so that then the second one they could do the weird stuff. Mm-hmm. And like, they are creating original characters, they are doing unique things with the characters, but like,
that's allowed.
It's allowed, and I think because it exists in its own world. Also, I love the voice cast choices. I love that Colleen got to stay as Tails. I think of all the actors to get to keep their roles, absolutely. But like, I've always been a big Ben Schwartz fan for a lot of years, and I think he's perfect as Sonic. I think that Idris Elba did an incredible job as a himbo to a T Knuckles.
The best form of Knuckles, himbo Knuckles, always.
Yes.
Always. Travis Willingham does a great job in Sonic Boom. So
yeah, yes, and like, I think the video game movies that continue to have success are the ones that lean into being original. Like, I think Detective Pikachu, though based on a game, kind of note for note, a less popular Pokemon game, the reason it does so well is because they take so much liberty with that film, and with some minor ableist nonsense aside, it does a really great job of going, this is this version of Pokemon. Right. Let's enjoy this.
Right.
And I think Sonic is leaning into that. I think that there's potential for this new Mario movie to do that, because with the Chris Pratt of it all aside, the Jack Black performance in that trailer was incredible. The Keegan-Michael Key performance in that trailer was incredible. I'm so excited about Ann Taylor-Joy's Princess Peach. I think that there's potential for Mario to be its own thing, and love or hate the Minions, love or hate that franchise, it's successful. And like, ultimately, if we want to get more of these, they have to be successful.
Correct.
Jeff and I are staunch defenders of the live action Mario movie, which is not good, but like, I think ultimately the reason the Sonic franchise might get to live on is not because of the games, but actually because of the movies, which, I mean, that's what saved Marvel. Marvel Comics was going bankrupt until the MCU. And I think if the Sonic movies are going to do that for the Sonic franchise, I am here for it, because the games sure as hell are having a hard time doing that.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. And what you said at the very end is exactly right. These movies have given the Sonic franchise the shot in the arm that it needed, that I think you're right, could save the franchise. And that's why I think Frontiers is such an exciting prospect, because they really, not necessarily being able to start at zero, but they've brought in a whole new fan base that isn't anchored down with what's happened over the last 20 years. Right. Like I think about like my kids love the Sonic movies. They're not Sonic fans. They don't play Sonic games. They haven't been playing Sonic games, but now you've got their attention. So now's the time. Like, let's get this right. You have a chance to redefine what this character is and what these games are. And I really hope they get it right, because and it's not to us. Like, they shouldn't be making that game for us. It should
Absolutely
be a good
not.
game. But yeah, if they're just trying to appeal to the middle-aged Sonic fans, then they're already failing.
Yep, exactly.
So I hope that's what they do, because that's right. The Sonic movies have changed the game for them completely.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, I think Sonic needs to if it wants to continue Attitude, it needs to be a child's version of Attitude. Because
Exactly.
really, in 1991, that's all it was.
Exactly.
and that's why. And then going back to the Sonic movie, that's why Ben Schwartz's version of Sonic works so well, because it had that little level of innocence, but at the same token, he also had that bravery and that courage that he earned or he learned to have throughout that film. Again, going even in an hour and a half, how he evolved so much in just that short period of time. Going back to, like, I talked with Roger Craig Smith earlier this year, and like he put it perfectly, because somebody asked him, like, what are your thoughts about some of the other voices of Sonic and how they played, like, the Jaleel Whites, the Ryan Drummonds, the Jason Griffith, like all the different ones that played through. And he talked about how it's like one of the biggest reasons why Sonic is still around today is because everybody has their own spin, and that spin translates to that generation. And the only way is, like, you can't have the same Sonic be the same Sonic every single generation. He has to change in some capacity. Otherwise, it's not going to translate well, he's not going to stick around. You can keep making ones for one specific generation the entire time, but then only that generation is going to buy, and the other ones are not. And at the end of the day, they got to make money in order for them to survive.
Absolutely.
So to me, that was a great analogy. It's like, you have to, that's why Mario's long. That's why Pokemon is so huge, because like your children's children are now experiencing this, and you're experiencing it along with them. Same for Sonic.
I've heard that same argument about Pokemon, because Pokemon's been around for 25 years, and the old school Pokemon fans are the biggest complainers about where Pokemon is, but they have to.
Yep, exactly.
You have to have that moment where you stop and say, "Wait a minute,
this might not be for you," and that's okay.
Why are they? Maybe they're not making this game for 47-year-old Pokemon fans. Maybe they're making it for fans that will be fans for the next 30 years.
You weren't calculating effort values and intrinsic values at the age of 7. Right. I mean, come on, get good.
But I think, yeah, you're right. I think, I can't remember, Jeff, it was you or Matt who just said it, but the Sonic movies have brought back that innocence. And speaking, watching those movies, but I should back that up. They did a fantastic job, especially in the second movie, balancing it so that me, as an old man who was 15 when Sonic came out, sitting there watching it with my kids, while they're really enjoying the character himself, they're giving us the little wink and nod, like the Mean Bean coffee company and all that sort of thing. It's like, oh, I get it. That's great. Like I feel seen when I'm watching that movie, but also knowing that, like, it goes back to what I was saying before with the original games. Although Sonic had attitude and he was cool and everything like that, like, the story was actually very sweet, right? The premise was sweet, and now Sonic is like that again. They've brought back this childlike innocence, and I'm sitting there watching it as a father and sort of looking at it from the standpoint of, like he's just a kid. He's trying to find his way. Like, this is what I'm seeing my children go through to a point.
Yeah,
and it makes you sort of love him in a different way.
Heroic.
And I hope they don't squander it.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to also speak to something G brought up before about, like, talking about making games for, and I think even Greg brought this up too, making games for don't make games for us. These games shouldn't be for us. They should be for kids now. One of the biggest fights I get into with the Pokemon community, and I love Pokemon. I played every generation now. I started playing Gen 2, which I've never played before, but I've played every other generation. But these games are not for us, the aging video game players. They are for the kids of the era. They are kids games. They were, and they are now. So the accessibility, the changes, the XP share of it all, it's always going to be for the kids. And I think that's the mistake that this is what G brought up before. That's the mistake that Sega's been doing. Sega continues to make games for us, Sonic games for us, the people who grew up with it.
Yeah.
And who are never going to be happy.
Yeah, don't chase
Right.
me.
And I don't think that's going to work. And what I'm hoping is that Sonic Frontiers is a game for this generation of video game players broadly, because I think that's where it'll find success. You know, I think it can work. The Toy Story movies work because Toy Story 3 and 4 were made for us, the people who grew up with those movies. But they were still designed and created as kids' movies that kids could just enjoy. And it's where the success in the Sonic movies are as well. And I think if the games can lean into that, that's where they will be successful. The new Mario games, the new Zelda games, the new Pokemon games, and any other franchise you can think of that's been around longer. It's just Nintendo tends to have the longest running franchises.
Right.
Those games are made constantly for the time, not a specific generation of video game player. Right. I think it's the mistake that the Assassin's Creed games have also been making. Like, I love that franchise in the early days. Up through 3, I played all of them. And like, that doesn't sound like a lot, but they were 3 Ezio games. But then they started iterating and making them the same. Instead of trying to appeal to current gen and what was new and what was different. I've heard they've started to do that with the newer games. I hadn't really enjoyed Origins, just I bounced off it because, again, the collectathon anxiety of it all. But like, I think at the end of the day, Sonic will find its strength in working to appease to the broader public and just kind of video game players in general, instead of trying to fit a round peg in a square hole.
Now, that being said, I still love having situations like Sonic Mania where, you know, let's not forget that Sonic does have a very rich history.
Yeah.
Also, I sort of put Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed in this as well.
Yes.
Where, you know, Sega has a rich history. So it's like, if you every now and then, please put together a game that has good core mechanics, but is also a love letter.
Yes, stuff it with references.
Like,
I'll have
Sonic and also Transformed is one of the greatest examples of that.
Yeah,
wonderful game.
Like, gee, exactly. Like in that game, I know the one thing that really there's many moments that stick with me, but the one that always really sticks with me is there's a track in that game, the Afterburner track,
yes, where
you're flying over the aircraft carrier and you're, you know, and the music is playing, and I mean, I'm getting tingles now just thinking about it. Like, you know, that's from a game from like 1985 or whatever year those games came out, and it's like, it's not relative in any way, but it's absolutely somebody saying, again, like, we see you as a company, like, we recognize our history and how important it is.
Yep.
But don't chase us. Just,
that's,
you know,
something beautiful. That
right. But going back to right. But going back to what you were saying before too, and this is one of the reasons why, and I apologize about this because I want to make it clear it's a perfectly fine game, but why one of my least favorite games in the entire Sonic franchise is Team Sonic Racing. It's one of my least favorite because it's like, it's such a huge step backwards. And but the sad thing is that when you talk to most people about it, most don't care because it's all about Sonic. And it's like, well, hey, it's only Sonic and I only care about Sonic. And I like, see, and that's unfortunate because they basically toss aside all the Easter eggs, all the rich history about everything else that Sega is involved in. And it's like, yes, this was not only just about Sonic, but then they were just like, okay, well, people only care about Sonic, so we're going to make it all about Sonic and we're going to centralize it around it. And guess what? The game didn't sell nearly as well as Sonic and All-Stars Transformed. And it didn't play nearly as well as Sonic and All-Stars Transformed. They went too safe with it. And so I just want to look at Sega with that and I just be like, okay, what did you learn?
Right.
I mean, look, I'm somebody that just wants to know how much money I need to raise for Sega to release a localized version, a remake of Sega Gaga. So I'm with you.
Oh my God, me too.
Yes,
oh my God.
Absolutely.
There's nothing I want more from the Sega franchise.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I like the Genesis Mini 2 is just, if you have not seen the Genesis Mini 2, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons because they picked so many games that are so part of the rich history that many people have never really known about. But one of the first things that I saw when they announced the game list, they're just like, somebody said immediately in the comments on Twitter, it's like, not enough Sonic. I'm like, oh my goodness, it's on everything. Literally, Sonic is on everything. Can we have one thing?
It's that one SNL sketch about the wishing well for special little boys. I don't get it. That you're not supposed to. You get everything. Everything is for you. And this one thing is for him. Like, yeah, you can play Sonic on everything. It's Doom. They release it everywhere. Yep. And it's the Mini 2. Do you know where Sonic is? It's the Mini 1.
Yeah.
Because it's out the door already.
Well, you got 3D Blast. There you go.
Oh,
You happy?
Oh, great! That's exactly what I was missing in my life. The slowest isometric gotta go fast experience of my life. Never have I been sadder to see birds.
Brutal.
It's funny, while I have this platform, I do want to say, like, with the re-releases that Sonic gets, we've gotten the Gems Collection, the Mega Collection, we just got Sonic Origins, which actually threads an animated narrative through the games, which I really love. I think it's smart.
Oh, that's the best part of the game.
Yeah, but the Switch especially has seen a lot of handheld collection re-releases, Castlevania and a few others. Give me Sonic Advance in the Sonic Rush series. Like,
yeah, I don't know what's going on with that.
You and I were talking about that on one of your streams. In the chat.
I don't understand why they have not capitalized on that. Seriously, Sonic Advance is a gold mine that they need to go back and rekindle to. And for some reason or another, maybe it's disagreements with Nintendo. I don't know. But for some reason, they need to go back to the Advance/Rush series because all of those games are great. And for some reason or another, not unlike Knuckles Chaotix, for some reason or another, Sega just will not go back to those games. And I don't know why.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, though, because it's so funny that we just got off this whole conversation about how don't make Sonic for us, make it for the kids, and then immediately launched into, but don't forget us.
Right.
But, I mean, you gotta feel for them. You gotta feel for a company like Sega or anybody that has Nintendo, again, is a great example. Any company that has a long running franchise like this is like, it's such a delicate balancing act, because I wholeheartedly agree with both points. I think I helped make both points there too, where it's like, make it for the new kids, don't forget us oldsters, and make sure you balance that. But I think also that's one of the reasons why it's so easy to look at the Sonic franchise as a whole and watch it be in a bit of a, I don't want to say a downhill spiral, but more like a, definitely peaks and valleys.
It's a servant of two masters.
Right. But it's also really easy to look back at the original games, and they were great games. But the nice thing that Sonic Team had going for it back then, and even Naoto Oshima with Sonic CD, is that there wasn't this lengthy history. There wasn't, they were building the lore, but now the lore is built, and now you have to balance that between what it was and what it is and what it's going to be. But I just thought it was really funny listening to this conversation where it was like, yeah, don't be crazy and focus only on us. But man, wasn't Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed awesome, and Sonic Mania was such a love letter to the fans? You should keep doing more of that. And it's like, well, okay.
But they don't need to do both at the same time.
Right.
Sonic Mania,
Specific
it works
releases.
because of it knew the assignment. It knew what it wanted to be. If you want to do a Sonic Origins, if we want to remake Chaotix, that's exactly what it is. Like, we're getting Chaotix back. Cool. There's no arguments about that. But if you want to take a new 3D game or even make a new 2D game and really try to appeal to everybody, you will appeal to nobody.
You're going to fail.
Yep. I think that's one of the reasons why Forces is looked at the way that it is because it immediately followed after Mania. To me, I think that was one of the greatest mistakes that Sega made with that game. Right. They could have given it a little bit more time in the oven to actually strengthen it up and beef it up a little bit. But because they knew that Sonic Mania was going to be a huge success and they wanted to ride that wave, like, they tried to pump out Forces as quickly as possible. And it's unfortunate because people are like, oh, it's not as good as Mania. I'm like, it's a completely different game.
Right.
You're absolutely
It's not the best game out there, but it's a perfectly fine Sonic game. But unfortunately, releasing a perfectly fine 3D, let me stress that, a perfectly fine 3D Sonic game right after a monumentally excellent 2D Sonic game, not a good move.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. And that's why I think Frontiers is so important. Because
it has to win.
Exactly. The iron is hot. They've had two really solid movies in the last 3 years. So, everyone's primed. So that's why it's so important. But you're right. If that game comes out and it doesn't appeal to the people who are interested in Sonic because of those movies, they'll have failed.
Yeah,
it will fail.
Yeah.
It's a must-win situation for Sega, and I'm hoping the best.
Yeah,
I will be playing it on Tuesday. And it's like, we'll see what happens.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I do want to point out before we start to wrap up, like, I think it's also important to talk about the one thing with Sonic that we haven't talked about, that while the attitude and the design and all this stuff was key to its success, some of the earliest success of the original Sonic games also is its music. It has some of the most iconic music in video game history. And the 3D games as well, Crush 40, people like to joke, but like, they are an incredible rock band that have made banger after banger for these games. And like, even the later stuff for Colors, different bands, different composers getting in there. Like, Sonic has had a through line consistently most probably in its music, going even from electronic to rock to whatever, like still like every Sonic song feels like a Sonic song. And it's why I might take a step back on my begging for a collection of the advanced and the Rush games, because as we've seen with collections, especially since the days of the Mega Collection and now more modern, they've not always handled that so well. And like, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the tragedy of Sonic Origins. And while I love that collection for a lot of reasons, it ruined my favorite game in an unintelligent way. Like, so Sonic 3 and Knuckles has some of my favorite music in the franchise. Geoff knows this, the listeners know this. Ice Cap Zone is my favorite video game song probably ever. It's just one of those vibing, awesome electronica songs that I just love. When I got up to that stage in Origins, I genuinely got upset, like physically upset, because it's just, not only is it a completely different song in there, the placeholder track, but the fidelity is not good. It's not well mixed. It's not well managed. And like, they made brand new songs and remixes for Mania not that long ago of iconic songs. So why couldn't they just recompose, remix, make brand new songs that are like, it wasn't an impossible task, but it was a rush to get this collection out the door, and it ruined one of my favorite games, a game that's not readily available anywhere. There's a PC Steam version that's not great.
Yeah.
And like, I don't own any old consoles at this point. So like, I don't have the Mega Collection. I don't have these older re-releases of the game. And like, control-wise, it's one of the tighter re-releases once they patched it. So just having the music gone is such a bummer. And I think it's that kind of carelessness that is really where Sonic and other Sega franchises really suffer. You know, it's a miracle that the Yakuza franchise is as good as it is. And it wasn't always, right? The early PS2 games have a lot of ups and downs, but like the current gen, like that studio, which is of course not just Sega, it's of course Ryogao Studio, like they get to let those games evolve and change in the way they wanted. They remade them in the way they wanted. And now it's one of the most successful Sega franchises in existence, to the point where they're re-releasing old games, porting over exclusive one-offs that never made it to the States. If all Sega Studios could get that kind of care, if Sonic Team could get that kind of care, I think re-releases and remakes of older games could be for everyone, right? Like, we joked about don't just make stuff for us, but I think the great thing about Advanced and the Rush series is a lot of modern Sonic fans would probably really love those games because they take stuff from the modern 3D Sonic games and incorporate them into the 2D games. I think the problem is that Sonic Team, and this could be a bigger problem in Sega, who knows, I'm speculating at this point, but Sonic Team doesn't get the care they need to make these games the way they should. Christian Whitehead's team clearly got that time with Mania, but we haven't really seen it since. And so I think that's where the biggest problem is, and where my biggest trepidation is with Frontiers.
It's
right.
Yeah.
Right. I want to point out one phrase you said, and I think it's where Sega's biggest issue is right now. And don't get me wrong, I want to make it perfectly clear. I love Sega. I will always love Sega, but I will definitely call them out whenever things like this happens. After they patched it.
Yeah.
That is a phrase that I think Sega has now unfortunately crutched on, that they feel that it's okay to release a game in the state that it is, knowing, oh, we'll just patch it later. And I'm like, no. And per to the point, we talked about this before we went live, and it's just like my biggest problem with the Sonic Origins collection. And I went out of my way. I was supposed to review it. I was supposed to do everything, but I decided to just, after I did my charity streams for it, I put it down and I was like, I'm not going to review this because I'm going to skate the hell out of this. Because the problem is that they took an entire year to do something that fundamentally, this is a compilation of 4 games: Sonic 1, Sonic 2, Sonic 3 Knuckles, and Sonic CD, right? 3 of those games were pretty much at the foundation were already done. They were all done by the Christian Whitehead headcanon team. They're already redone in HD. They're already remastered. They just needed to add a few things, the mission mode, the anniversary mode, all that good stuff.
Right.
That's literally it. Story mode, cool. That's all. So what else is left? And this took them an entire year, and then they released it in the buggy mess state. Tails fundamentally broken. Like all the ways that I don't understand what happened with this. And that kind of where my point is that Sega needs to understand that you can't just drop this. And the problem is because we buy it regardless.
Yeah.
So since we buy it regardless, they don't learn. That's really the only issue with that.
Tricky,
and and that breaks my heart too, because it broke my heart first time I heard because I went out of my way to not listen to any of the new music before Origins came out. I wanted to experience it live for the first time on stream. And I swear I need to go back and look at my VODs for it, because my expression hearing those songs in Sonic 3 and Knuckles for the first time. And then not only that, the songs that they were able to keep, they were not in good quality with that. It's just Origins to me was just a complete, it was such a disappointment, and it broke my heart.
Yeah.
It really, really broke my heart.
Yeah.
So at the same token, it's like, if this is how you're going to pay homage to this for the older fans, then honestly, just focus on the new stuff at this point. Because like, yeah, if that's how it's going to be, because again, we're going to buy it regardless. So I always say this multiple times, vote with your wallet. If it's something that's not good, don't buy it. And again, I love it. And I hope I'm not like, ruffling feathers to take it by saying this, but it's like, you know what? Y'all really can do better with this.
I think that, I don't know if I'm using the right word, the custodianship of Sonic as a whole. It seems like they've got people in charge of that now, but it feels like for a long time they didn't. And it was just a team or multiple teams sort of floundering around trying to figure out what to do next. And if you go back and you look at read some interviews and sort of the history of Sonic, again, as they got into the multi-platform, it really feels like they're just running to catch up a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And that's not the way to do that, especially with a tentpole franchise like Sonic and one with such a rich history. Like, you need to, again, going back to, yes, you want to make sure that you're bringing in the new fans, but you have to respect what's already there. And
exactly.
I hope that that's where they're at now. It seems like that's where they're at now, but
it feels like it.
Yeah, but I agree with pretty much everything you just said. Also, Matt, going back to what you were saying about the music, you're absolutely right. It's funny because talking about great Sonic games, I personally, the first one is still my favorite, weirdly enough. But when I play Sonic 2, I play to listen to the music. It's, like Chemical Plant Zone. My God, that music is amazing.
Top tier.
And I think it's really telling, going back to what you were saying before, that the first time most people saw Sonic, he was on a tour bus for Dreams Come True. I mean, that's how they introduced the character, was through the band that was doing the music for the game. Like, that's how important music is to this series.
And that's not to like downplay Koji Kondo and other incredible composers for the Nintendo franchise. I just think it's just integral to the flow. Again, the momentum of these games. I think the music is integral to that in a way that it isn't always for other games. And I think that's why it's so iconic in that way.
No, absolutely.
Well, Sonic was supposed to be part of a band, right? I mean, that was his origin story.
That's true, yeah.
Sonic Underground.
Yep.
There it is.
Yeah.
Well, and I also think of, again, to talk about fandom, I think of like remix communities, like Overclock Remix and things like that. The two franchises where it's kind of like, well, of course you're going to remix from this franchise. Mega Man, Sonic.
Yep.
Plenty of other games have plenty of fantastic music. But as far as top to bottom, stage to stage, banger after banger, fast, slow, electronic, rock, whatever, Sonic is up there. Deservedly so.
Agree.
And should never be discounted.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. It's incredibly important.
Before we start to wrap up and talk about our favorites and maybe our most underrated favorite, I think will be more fun because we've kind of all talked about our favorite games already. I do want to say that I think the thing that actually quite represents the Sonic franchise most poignantly is something we haven't talked a lot about, but it's the peak animation popularity of Sonic. And what I mean by that, although I'm sure Sonic X was pretty popular and so was Sonic Boom, the two Sonic the Hedgehog cartoons that were out in the late 90s, early 2000s, the Jaleel White, well, they were both voiced by Jaleel White, but the comedy one and the more serious comic book based one existed together and had their diehard fans. I, as a kid, was always like, oh, the serious one's better. I'm such a teenager, blah, blah, blah. I've gone back and watched both. They're both quite enjoyable. And the goofy one is actually very funny.
I loved the goofy one as a kid. That was my preference.
I challenge, I said this on stream too. I challenge anybody because I was one of those people. In fact, if you go back, you see like some of my old YouTube videos of my Sonic collection. I talk about Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. It's not my favorite. I don't really care for it. Here's the thing. I always challenge anybody. Like, if you grew up with Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog and you kind of felt that way, go back and watch it now. It's like there's a lot of like subtle, well, it's quirky and it's dumb in a fun sort of way. There's a lot of little tiny intricacies that make that show actually kind of brilliant. And the funny thing is that like over time, I always said that Sonic Sat AM, the Archie comic adaptations and whatnot was the absolute best and could not be topped. The funny thing is that now as an adult, it's kind of on the lower end for the Sonic cartoons now. Yeah. It's like, I do need to go back and watch Sonic X again. That's for sure. But like, as far as those adventures though, I mean, I say everybody go back and watch it. If it's still kind of cringe, then that's all good. But go back and like try and watch it and you'll realize it. You'll laugh a lot more than you think you did. You will.
But I do think they are emblematic of the greater problem with this franchise is that we have two very competing ethos that are still using the same core momentum, as it were, with Sonic, and Jaleel White powering that. And I think that ultimately the biggest problem with the Sonic franchise is that it has so many identities, not that it only has one. And I think what Sonic Frontiers and the movies hope to coalesce is a more broad, inviting starting point for Sonic, whereas it had been so convoluted. And I think that's important for any franchise. You know,
I agree.
And I think that it's why I am optimistic about this future of the Sonic franchise, because we have a new starting point, a new ground zero to build from. And I'm hoping that the Sonic team and the creators of both the film and the games take advantage of that and run with it and invite more kids specifically to this, because they are the largest and loudest consumer base are the kids. The loud adults can be the loudest and sometimes the shittiest, but they are not the ones that we should be catering all this stuff to ultimately.
Correct.
Because I think that will spur the growth we want for this franchise.
Yep, exactly. Because like the ones that are going to be the most vocal might not be necessarily the ones that are going to put the series in the right limelight that it needs,
Right.
and or the ones that are going to be spending the cash.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's a business.
I remember reading an article from an athlete once. I forget who it was, but they were called out by an age-old fan about the fact that like they were in line or something, not in line, but in a crowd, and this athlete came down and he was signing autographs for all the kids and he was giving swag to all the kids, and this 40 or 50 something year old man was like, why are you ignoring your older fans? And I always love the response. Like, I appreciate all my fans, but you know, that 5-year-old that I just took my hat off and signed and gave that's a fan for life. As cynical as this sounds, that's going to carry my brand through the next few decades.
Correct.
Sorry, 50 something year old man, you know, I really appreciate you, but that's who I'm catering to. Because
you made that analogy with WWE and the Attitude Era.
Right.
That falls right into that.
Yeah.
Yep. Same with Sonic.
Yeah, to go with, I guess, the watchword of the show, it's a lot harder to build momentum than to maintain momentum.
Yeah.
That's true.
Before we wrap up and before you guys plug your various incredible properties and awesome endeavors, I think it'd be more fun, instead of talking about our favorite games, because we mostly have, to talk about maybe your most underrated fave, or a game that people might be surprised is your favorite besides the penultimate or ultimates. Like for me, we touched on it a bit, but Sonic Rush Adventure for the I believe it was the DS.
Yes.
Yep.
Is one of my favorite Sonic games of all time, because it took the best parts of 2D Sonic, 3D Sonic, and even light RPG elements and like adventure game elements, and coalesced it in this very unique and kind of wholly original game. And there is no legal way to play it currently unless you own an original DS and a copy of it. But I highly recommend, if you can get your hands on it somehow, some way, that you play this game above and beyond all of the other portable Sonic games. And it's why I want a portable collection, because they've been doing it with other franchises, but also I think these games deserve a new light, because I feel like Advance 1, 2, and 3 and Rush Adventure just didn't really get as much love at the time as I think they deserve. I don't hear a lot of people talking about them, and they are definitely some of my favorites. It's no secret on this show, especially considering recent episodes, that I am a mobile portable gamer. Like, I like my Switch. I like playing games on the couch in my hands. And some of these games are some of those best kind of moment-to-moment Sonic games that were ever made. And so definitely, for sure, specifically Sonic Rush Adventure, I feel like other folks should check that out. Jeff, what about you?
I mean, back to the start of things, I'm a big fan of the portable games. I played some Sonic Advance, but I spent a lot of time with the Game Gear games. I do love Sonic Triple Trouble, but I am also going to defend sort of the ethos of my house and say Sonic Spinball. It was a bit of a rush job.
Yes.
But honestly, they need to explore that more. I think something of where 2D and 3D can come together in the sense of momentum and all this other stuff. If you have vertical momentum going on, whether you want to make a big crazy Sonic Spinball proper, like the idea of a pinball platformer with Sonic kind of makes a lot of sense. And if you have that fast and slow momentum, because you're dealing with vertical aim and momentum, not just forward, you can get a lot with that. And you have the air combat and the juggling kind of thing to it. And I think there's a lot that you can do with that. Yeah, no, Sonic Spinball's got its ups and its downs, whether the Genesis or the Game Gear version, but it's something really unique and really fun. And I'm a huge fan of
it. Greg, what about you?
Well, I mean, I mentioned earlier that I know we're not talking about favorites, but I'm totally old school on Sonic in general. And I still, Sonic CD still sits there as one of my favorites of all time. Good. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it's kind of a glorious mess in a lot of different ways. It's not as beautifully designed as the sort of mainline Genesis versions at all, like especially the level design. It's kind of going back
Time
and
travel's
playing
a
it
little
more
wonky.
recently. Right. And going back and playing more recently, that's just it. Like you're kind of looking around, it's like, God, there's so much going on here, and there's not really a great flow to a lot of the levels. But some of the things that I really loved about it, I'm a big fan of world building sort of outside the margins, and I feel like Sonic CD really does that in a great way, where there's not endless exposition, there's no dialogue, but there's not a lot of dialogue explaining what's going on. You're kind of left to see these different things and notice these different parts of the world and put it all together yourself, like the introduction of Amy. And there's a bit of great storytelling in game there where Mecha Sonic appears and kidnaps her, and where you've got the race with him and
that was
Robotnik,
cool.
right, stuff like that. But also the time travel, as wonky as it was, even that little sort of thing where you're going into the future and seeing a destroyed world, or going into the past and seeing like what clearly Robotnik has gone back and created this ruin with these machines that he's left in the past that you can go and destroy and actually change the future. Like, there's just a lot of great world building outside of what you're seeing on the screen. And of course you have to make the logic leaps yourself, but I think that is that game's biggest strength. And it sort of helped expand Sonic out a little bit more than it already had been, but sort of staying true to its origins as far as the story of industrialization versus the natural world.
Also, Sonic Boom, all-time banger, and that opening anime cutscene, one of the best.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Definitely
incredible.
That song. They had a version of this game. I can't remember. It might be the Steam version, but there was a version that was released at one point without Sonic Boom. They had lost the rights briefly to it.
Then is it even Sonic CD?
It's just not worth it. But yeah, that song is an all-time banger and always in rotation for me.
And I will argue something that is not often spoken about of Sonic CD that I think is a great design choice. It is of the time where you needed to get all the Chaos Emeralds, or in this case, the Time Stones, in order to get the good ending, in order to get all of that. It gave you two different ways to do it, and they were very different play styles. You could do the get 50 rings, get to the end, and do the special stages, and do that and get the Time Stones that way. Or you could explore and you could do the time travel and engage with that, and you find the machines in all of the levels and make the good futures.
Yeah.
And so I did want to bring this up. We were talking about this before we went live. Playing through Sonic CD, some of those other ones, this is something that my spouse and I have been kind of doing as retro gamers. I played a little Sonic CD when I was younger, but I never got to delve. So we played Sonic CD for the first time this year. And Sarah is somebody that does not repeat games. She plays a game, she's done with it. She reads a book, she's done with it. She's very always to the next thing. This was a game that we finished. We didn't worry about like doing the best or whatever else. We played some special stages. We tried to find some things. We finished it. We immediately began again. Sarah was the one who was like, all right, we're getting the good ending. Let's go. And so I'm sitting there with like the maps. It's like, where do I go? Jeff, where do I go? How do I get, where's the machine? Where's a pat? Like, it was incredible. It was just, we were a submarine crew in a World War II movie screaming at each other about this. It was the best. And to Sarah's past is much more Mario platformer. She loved that game. She loved Sonic CD so much. And then we also have a 32X that we recently acquired from a friend. And we played Chaotix for the first time. And the sheer difference of platforming versus physics. I've never seen her this mad at a video game before. She does not rage quit. She does not rage. She raged.
That's not surprising.
Not surprising.
It was so funny.
Endlessly heartbreaking that one of the prettiest pixel art games ever made is also one of the most difficult to play.
It deserves some kind of second chance, whether on a collection, in something. Chaotix, love it or hate it, there is great beauty.
Yeah.
Sega needs to stop ignoring Chaotix. Seriously, get it on some. That would have been a wonder. Going back to Sonic Origins, imagine what kind of a bonus that would have been as like a hidden bonus if they tossed in Chaotix on that, especially because the art and the soundtrack is in the game.
Maybe it's
in the game. So why didn't they put it in there? Why?
Yeah,
I know.
What about you, G? What is your underrated classic or underrated game that you really love?
Oh boy, so I know mine's going to be very divisive amongst a lot of people because I stand this game quite a bit, and because we already talked about Sonic Master System because I love that Sonic 1 Master System is one of my favorites.
Absolutely.
Sonic also is transformed to probably the greatest games in the whole franchise that I feel do not get enough love, but there's one that I feel just gets hated so very much. And when the first time I played this one, I didn't quite understand it, but when I sat down and I got it and I really understood how the game works, I was like, this game's actually quite great. And that's Sonic Lost World. Sonic Lost World is the one that because the thing is that sometimes you have to really stand back and kind of look at how a game is just good and it's just fun to play, even if it goes against the grain of what a franchise is quote unquote supposed to be. So like say, again, going back to the whole original fans versus like the gotta go fast generation of Sonic. I like to call it the gotta go fast generation. So when I think that Sonic is all about just going from A to B as fast as you possibly can, but realizing that sometimes you have to stop and think, otherwise you just wind up dead in like the original Sonic. Sonic Lost World, it's like, yes, it's kind of really close to Sonic Mario Galaxy. I get it. But the thing is that the way that the level design like really challenges your way to think differently. And like the boss fight challenge you to think differently amongst like any other Sonic game, utilizing your homing attack to your best possible way. And when the game moves, it moves so fluidly, so well. Like, yeah, I understand the Deadly Six aren't exactly the greatest villains when it comes to Sonic, but like maybe because I really thrive on things when they're weird and different, but just click. And to me, Sonic Lost World was just weird enough, just different enough. But I had such a really great time playing this game. And it's a shame that they're probably never going to go back to the style of game for Sonic. And I get it. It didn't sell well. It didn't do well with the fans. So they're probably never going to come back to it. But it's the one that I always seem to like, whenever I pop it up, I'm like, man, it's just such a shame that people didn't give this game a proper chance, especially since it's on Steam. Like it's on Steam now. So like you could easily play it off that. But yeah, I feel like that's the one that like I unabashedly is one of my favorite games in the franchise, and people just don't give enough love to it. So that's why I challenge anybody. If you don't like it, you know, hey, at least you tried. But I always say, hey, try it out and see if it's your thing. Like for some reason, it just really clicked with me.
Interesting. Yeah, it's one of those games that I played that last year, or maybe it was earlier this year. I can't remember. And I just bounced off it immediately. And I rarely I played Sonic Forces to completion multiple times, and that's not a great game either. Like, I don't know. Something about it didn't jive with me, but but this is why I wanted to have this conversation, and why I think the Sonic franchise is so interestingly unique, even though we compared it to a bunch of other stuff. I think that's just kind of the nature of talking about these long-running franchises, is that there's been so many games that your favorite could be wildly different from someone else's, and or there are things that are unanimous, like we talked about how Sonic Boom is a banger, but like there's so many things that are just not agreed upon in this franchise. And I think that's interesting. I think that's a bonus to this franchise, not a detriment. I think that so many people will have different favorites or different things they love. Like the fact that Geoff exists in this pocket of Game Gear, which I did as well, but like I think a lot of us did, but like not everyone does. Most probably modern Sonic video game players probably never played any of the Game Gear or Master System games. And I think that diversity of the pantheon of Sonic is what makes it so rich. And I think there is a way to acknowledge your past while still creating something new for the future. And I think, again, the biggest thing that I'm excited about with Frontiers is that it seems to finally understand that. We'll see. As of when we're recording, we haven't played it yet, but by the time you hear it, we'll have. I'm sure on all of our Twitter feeds, you'll find some kind of acknowledgement of how we feel about it by now.
If there's still Twitter, then we'll tweet about it.
That exactly. It's very true. Follow me on Mastodon. I don't have a Mastodon, but I think generally that's why this conversation was wonderful. Thank you both for joining us, Greg and G. This was wonderful. Before we wrap up, first Greg and then G, promote where you can be found if you wish to be found on the internet. If you wish people to find your work, tell them where they can find it.
Sure. I am one of the co-hosts of the Player One podcast. There's three of us are the ex-video game journalists from the EGM and Expert Gamer Game Now era. You can find that at playerone.podcast.com. Every Sunday night we stream and we publish on Tuesdays. We're about 850 some odd episodes old. So, you know, we've been doing it a while. If you want to hear three old white guys talk about old video games and being fathers, that's the other big thing, come give us a listen. I think that's a pretty good sales pitch, right? You can also find me on youtube.com/Sewart, where you'll find my Genesis history series called Generation 16, where I'm going through the games in chronological order for the most part, although I've been focusing on Laser Active and working on a Mega Drive Mini 2 video right now, trying to get it out before G does. So you can find
You've got time, trust me. You've got time.
And you can find me on Twitter at Sewart and on Twitch at twitch.tv/Sewart. Please come check out my stuff.
Do it.
Cool.
What about you, G?
All right, so you can find me at G to the next level, like, you know, welcome to the next level, but with a G, like me. You can find me pretty much anywhere: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Twitch, YouTube, all that good stuff. Just search for G to the next level. My YouTube and my Twitch are completely separate entities. My live stream Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, unless I have a convention happening. mostly do retro inspired stuff. Tuesdays I do viewer requests. Sundays I do Shining Force Sundays and other RPGs.
Nice.
Thursdays I normally do like modern retro inspired style games, and then Fridays I play Switch games with viewers, mainly Mario Party and of course Splatoon, because I love Splatoon dearly. But yeah, you can find me basically on there. YouTube, it's pretty much all retro, but with a little tiny bit of a Sega flair. You can find all kinds of good Sonic stuff there as well. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Fantastic.
Thank you both so much. This was wonderful. It drives me crazy that it took me so long to make something like this happen, mostly because I know Scoop Jessica, who I'll shout out one more time, has been yelling at me for years practically at this point.
Oh, well, Jess is wonderful.
Jess is freaking incredible.
Yeah.
We don't deserve Jess. She's
her
wonderful.
and Joey. They're both awesome.
Yep. And Joey is really too hot. It's just shouldn't be allowed to be that
I
attractive.
agree.
I'm gonna third that one.
Yeah. Listeners, thank you for being a part of this retrospective. We will probably do another one since we barely scratched the surface of Sonic. Like I said, we didn't talk about the comics at all.
We'll find some corners to specialize in.
I'm down.
But let us know your favorites, your least favorites. Are you excited for Sonic Frontiers? Like, I've said this a bunch during this recording, but I really mean it. Like, I just feel like there is no franchise like Sonic because it's just been so off the wall due to its lack of leadership, probably, but still, like, there's no franchise that has been so wildly all over the place. So someone's favorite might be something we've never even played or heard of. Like, we didn't even talk about any of the puzzle games. Like, Mean Bean Machine was a game I put probably an embarrassing amount of hours into in the Genesis era. So like,
Oh, yeah.
just tell us your thoughts. I'm curious where people lay in the Sonic pantheon, as it were.
Absolutely, because this is one where I am so looking forward to hearing the wide variety of favorites. Like, do you think we need more Sega Pocket Arcade? Did it take you as long as it took me to remember that that's what those weird handheld things were called? I played the Sonic one so much, and I think of Chaos Emeralds, they're shaped like that still. Is it the same for you? What shape is the Chaos Emerald for you? What order are the colors? How do these things go? The well is so deep. Please let us know your thoughts, your favorites, and everything else. And there's so many ways to reach out to us. You can find us on social media, Twitter and Instagram, Fun and Games Pod. You can email us at Gmail, funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, previous episodes, previous guests, who we should have on the show in the future, what series we should talk about more, because we do this to celebrate gaming and our love of games and yours. And so we want to hear from your love of gaming as well.
You can also interact with us by going to certainpov.com and joining our Discord server, not just for this podcast, but for all of the incredible podcasts over at certainpov.com. We have podcasts about video games, about movies, about TV, about comic books, about books without pictures, all sorts of great stuff. We're trying to build a community over there where we can openly discuss the things we love and hate without like the judgment of Twitter specifically, whether it lives or dies by the time this airs. And so we really would love for y'all to interact with us there. Of course, if you have a moment, please rate and review us on your podcast platform of choice. I know I say this every episode, but really, really it does help. Our audience grows every time we get a review. Hell, even if it's a bad review, I think the algorithm does not care, but like 5 stars if you're not really that particular. Please tell us why you love the show. We also read each and every review and love to hear from y'all. So please interact with us that way as well. Of course, you can find Geoff on Twitter at Geoff Makes Noise. I am DJ_Stormageddon over there. We have a ton of other stuff that we do outside of this podcast as well. I urge you to check that out. We've got some great stuff planned for the end of this year. We, of course, are going to have our year in review conversation early next year, but like we are planning some big stuff for the wrap up of this year and early next year. And we're so happy to have you all on the ride with us.
Yeah, we want to hear from all of you about this because this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey there, Screen Beans. Have you heard about Screen Snark?
Rachel, this is an ad break. They aren't screen beans until they listen to the show.
Fine. Potential Screen Beans. You like movies and TV shows, right?
I mean, who doesn't? Screen Snark is a casual conversation about the movies and television shows that are shaping us as we live our everyday lives.
That's right, Matt. We have a chat with at least one incredible guest every episode, hailing from all walks. We've interviewed chefs,
Writers, costumers, musicians,
yoga teachers, comedians, burlesque dancers,
folks in the film and TV industry.
and more.
We'd be delighted for you to join us every other Monday on the Certain POV Podcast Network.
Or wherever you get your podcasts, fresh and tasty off the presses.
What? That's not.
Can I call them Screen Beans now?
Fine.
Screen Beans.
So tune in and we'll see you at the movies or on a couch somewhere.
Cause you're all Screen Beans now.
She will be mine. CPOV. CertainPOV.com.